Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Austin Harris, the Director of Member Engagement here at the Kansas Association of School Boards, and we're here today to bring you our first reactions to the elections last night. There's a great deal that we don't know at 12 p.m. the day after the election. For the first time in over 20 years, we're not sure who the President of the United States is going to be, unfamiliar territory. Many uncalled Senate elections at the federal level, House races certainly still up in the air. And even at the state level, we don't have all the answers as of yet. So a lot of uncertainties, but there's a few things we do know about last night. Early predictions showed that turnout will exceed any other election since the year 1900, shattering records in most states. And whether you're a Democrat, Republican, or independent, that is something worth celebrating. Turnout's good for democracy, and we all celebrate that. In addition, several school districts across the state were able to successfully pass bond issues last night as public schools continue to fight for their students, for their community, and for education across the state. We continue to watch presidential election results come in, but in the state of Kansas, we have many more results. We're going to dig into all of that today. I'm joined this afternoon by our fantastic advocacy team here at KASB. I'm here with Leah Fleiter,
Director of Governmental Relations,
Scott Rothschild,
Communications Editor,
and Mark Dahlman,
Associate Executive Director for Advocacy.
So let's start with the federal side of the elections. We thought we were going to have a couple of pretty competitive races here in Kansas. Early polls over the summer showed Marcia and Boyer in particular were going to be close. Final results shows a little bit of widening in the final months. But Leah, walk us through what happened in Kansas with our federal elections, and then we'll take a look at the picture across the nation.
Well, that's right, Austin. You know, fundraising numbers when they came in towards the end of the race there were pretty startling for the Democrat, Barbara Boyer, and I think Democrats thought they had a decent chance at taking that seat for the first time in decades. But last night, incumbent representative for the first U.S. Congress district, Roger Marshall, did defeat State Senator Boyer by about almost 10 points, I think, in Kansas. And so he will be advancing to the Senate seat that is being retired by Senator Pat Roberts, who's been in the state, in the Congress for decades, I think 40 years service for Senator Pat Roberts in Washington, D.C. on behalf of the state of Kansas. So that is something that the Republicans are very pleased about. And I know the Senate campaign folks nationwide were looking at flipping that seat, but that did not happen. So Kansas retains its party balance as far as our congressional seats go. Tracy Mann, the Republican, beat Democrat Callie Barnett to take Marshall's House seat that he retired to run for the Senate. Jake LaTurner is going to advance to the House District 2 seat that is vacated by Steve Watkins. LaTurner had a battle with Topeka Mayor Michelle De La Isla. Again, her fundraising was also pretty good at the end, but he did pull away last night, so he'll be advancing to D.C. Representative Sharice Davids, who represents the Kansas City area, will serve a second term in Congress in that district. That's House District 3. And then Representative Ron Estes will represent House District 4, which is based in the Wichita area. He keeps his seat and will continue to serve for another 2 years in the U.S. Congress from the Wichita area.
Yeah, so Senate races, congressional races in Kansas, some new faces, but no shift in the party makeup of the delegation we send to Washington, D.C., but certainly some disappointment for Democrats in the state who thought they were going to be more competitive in some of these races, and really a reflection of what happened nationally for Democrats last night in congressional and Senate races across the board. Looks like Democrats are going to hold on to the House of Representatives in Congress. The Senate is still very much in flux. National pundits are watching 3 or 4 races still, trying to figure out who's going to eke out a majority there. And of course, the White House is the big question mark. So as we sit today, what do we know about the state of education politics at the federal level, and what do we need more time to figure out?
Well, we do know that the kind of divided government that we have right now, as far as the Senate and House makeup, although we're still watching the Senate, it does look like the U.S. Senate will probably stay Republican. So you have Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell and Democratic Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi, and they I think are starting their plans to move forward. They announced this morning that they do want to work on a new stimulus bill that they would like to have done by the end of this calendar year. We had been hearing previously that that might not happen until January after the election. So that is a little bit of positive news that we're watching this morning. The interesting play there is that the Senate Republicans tend to have taken a little more tailored approach to stimulus funding and to K-12 funding. Their levels are lower than what the House has traditionally sought. McConnell did say this morning that he is in favor of including state and local aid to state and local governments in a stimulus bill. He has opposed that previously. So we'll have to see how that jockeying begins. But he said, the Senate comes back into session next week, and he hopes to start working on a bill. So that's a little bit of good news, provided that those two parties are able to work together. Now, of course, we are still looking at that top race. If Vice President Biden were to become president, he's still going to have to probably work with a divided Congress. So, a Democratic president could get his legislative agenda through the House, but then it could still be blocked by the Senate. So we'll continue to see some struggles there, I think, regardless of who's at the top of the ticket.
Right. And it's a big if, but if Joe Biden finds a way to get to the 270 electoral votes he needs, and there's certainly a path for that right now, there are some questions about a divided Senate regarding federal appointments to some of those departments, for our sake, specifically the Department of Education, and what it would look like for a Democratic president to try to get a nominee through a Mitch McConnell and Republican Senate. So some big questions there. It's a big if Joe Biden's going to get that win or if Donald Trump will remain president. But a lot of questions out there.
I think we've seen, and of course, Leah really follows this more closely, is at the federal level, that distinction between what Congress is able to do and with divided government, not very much has been what has tended to happen, but the power of the executive agencies.
Yes.
There's limits to that, but as I think most people know, President Trump appointed Betsy DeVos as Secretary of Education, a strong supporter of school choice, private school funding, and all of those, has taken different positions on a lot of other regulatory issues. And so what I think we've seen is aggressive moves on the part of this Secretary of Education, which follow, of course, in previous administrations that happening. So while there is the issue of divided government for passing substantive legislation, whoever's president, assuming he can get people confirmed, and I think we found even if you don't get people confirmed, you still appoint people to run these agencies. It still happens. So that the president will have an impact, whoever he ends up being, on some of those questions that will affect education policy.
Absolutely. So lots of questions left at the federal level. We expect some results from Wisconsin and Michigan to continue to roll in today at the presidential level. Nevada, we know, is not going to report any more votes until tomorrow as they wait for mail-in ballots to come in. Pennsylvania's indicated it could be Friday before we get any clear numbers there. So as they've predicted from the beginning, this was not an election day, but an election week. Still a lot of uncertainty, but at the state level, we have a lot more confidence in the races that have been called. We've got some very tight ones, and we'll talk about that, but some more cohesive results. As we shift our attention to the state races, just a quick note. If you have any questions, you can feel free to drop those into the chat. We'll do our best to monitor that and try to respond to the best we can. We won't pretend to have all the answers here this afternoon, but we'll do our best to respond to what you've got. So let's talk a little bit about the state races. Again, state Democrats thought that there were some hopes to pick up a couple Senate seats, a couple of House seats, and at least in the Senate, we didn't see that change. They went into this race sitting at 29-11, Republicans and Democrats. They come out of this race right now sitting at 29-11. So on the surface, not a big change, Leah, but what do you see when we dig into the makeup of the two caucuses and the environment that's going to be in the Senate in this next legislative session?
What we see, Austin, is that the Senate Republican caucus has become more conservative. And the reason that's important is that the Republicans are in the majority in the Senate, and that caucus will cast the deciding votes on who will lead the Senate for the next session. So you have three key positions that are open this year because of retirements. We have the Senate President spot, which was vacated by retiring Senate President Susan Wagle from the Wichita area. We have the Senate majority leader spot was vacated by retiring Senator Jim Denning from Johnson County. And then we have Senator Jeff Longvine, who won his reelection down in the kind of Lyon County Emporia area. Senator Longvine is currently serving as the Senate Vice President and is interested in advancing to Weigel's Senate President spot, but he will most likely be challenged by a more conservative senator, perhaps Senator Ty Masterson, because that caucus is now trending a little bit more conservative than it was previously. So it's likely that the more moderate Longvine will be challenged by somebody from within his own caucus for that Senate president seat. Now, the interesting thing that we would like to note is Senator Carolyn McGinn from Sedgwick, longtime member of the legislature and a former county commissioner, has expressed her interest in running for that Senate Majority Leader spot. And the reason that's important is that the Senate Majority Leader is the person who really controls the floor agenda in the Kansas Senate. That is the position that controls what bills are voted on. McGinn has already notified her fellow senators and senators-to-be that she is interested in this position. She said, I will be a partisan. I'm a Republican. I will be partisan, but I will also be reasonable and try to work across the aisle and try to come to good decisions for the state of Kansas. I think she is considered to be somewhat of a moderate compared to other people in the caucus. So it will be interesting to see if she will also perhaps draw a more Republican conservative challenger in the Senate. And the reason all of that is important is that leadership in each house are the folks who appoint the committee chairs and committee members that oversee the legislation that we lobby on or against on your behalf.
Correct. And with the change in leadership, we expect decent shakeup in the makeup of those committees. Not just Republicans with a big leadership question before them in the Senate. Here in Topeka, Anthony Hensley, the dean of the Democratic Caucus, a longtime state senator, lost his reelection bid. How's that impact the Democratic Caucus?
Well, now, you know, the Democratic Caucus will look for a new leader. You could, for as far as folks who have been around for a while, you have State Senator Tom Hawk, State Senator Tom Holland. You have Pat Petty from the Johnson County area. You have Marcy Francisco from the Lawrence area. Those are folks who typically are articulating positions on behalf of the Senate Democrats. And so how that might work out for that caucus.
Yeah. And of course, a big note for the governor's office, the Senate supermajority is 27 seats. That gives them the ability to overturn a gubernatorial veto. Currently, it's sitting at 29-11. So again, there is the potential that that supermajority could overturn a governor's veto during that session of the legislature.
And that creates a different dynamic than some of our folks probably remember from under Governor Brownback when when the Republicans had a large majority, but a governor who could sign bills if anything passed. The dynamic now is on controversial legislation. You may face a gubernatorial veto from a governor of the opposite party. That puts that override in play. The Republicans will certainly have a majority in both houses, as we'll see, to do that if they all vote together. And that really will reflect, so where is that kind of long-standing moderate conservative split? You know, you run with a party label that doesn't guarantee where you are or how you'll vote, sort of along that spectrum. And so even though that supermajority is there, that we can't automatically count on that.
Well, and also with supermajorities in both houses, we could be looking at constitutional amendments, which require 2/3 votes. And in the past, there have been attempts to maybe change the way Supreme Court justices are nominated and things like that. Ultimately, those kinds of issues could affect education.
Sure.
I think one other thing just to note, a little, I got to do the history. One bit of history I have to do with a nod to Senator Hensley is that when I started lobbying, not for KASB, but right out of college, Senator Hensley was in the legislature. I believe that he was elected in the 70s, kind of around Watergate time. So not only do we not have Dale Dennis in the State Department of Education, this is the first session in decades that will not have Senator Hensley somewhere in the legislature. But a little bit more recent, it's striking to note that 8 years ago, about 8 Republican moderates were defeated by conservatives as part of a big change. Then 4 years later, 8 conservatives were either defeated or replaced or retired. Now we've again seen a switch back, not as big a shift, but we seem to be in this every 4 years, at least recently. Senate composition of the Senate seems to change a little bit.
And it's an important note that the state legislature operates a little bit differently than what we're used to at the federal level, where there is a lot more votes that don't follow strictly with party lines. So just because there's supermajority in both houses does not necessarily mean that either party will be able to use that supermajority to overturn vetoes or activate amendments or other policies like that. So it'll be an interesting session in the Senate. It'll also be an interesting session in the House. Scott, we've got a lot of narrow races still out there. I think our closest is 11 vote lead right now.
4 vote,
A 4 vote lead. So a lot of tight races. As it looks right now, Republicans appear to have picked up 3 seats, giving them 87 in the chamber. Again, a supermajority in the House of Representatives is 84 seats. So they've crossed that threshold, but could end up a little over that, right around it, a little under that, depending on some of these tight races that are probably going to go to a recount.
Well, that's right, Austin. And, we started the night out with 84 Republicans and 41 Democrats. And right now we're sitting at 87 Republicans, 38 Democrats. That gives the Republican Party a supermajority. And I think the Democrats were thinking going in, if they can flip 1 seat, they can avoid that supermajority. Obviously, for Democrats, that's a disappointment. We thought that I think the Democrats were thinking that in Johnson County they would pick up more seats than they did. Laura Kelly, Governor Kelly, ran very well in Johnson County 2 years ago, and in some of these districts that were held by Republicans, she won by double-digit numbers. Now, that could be because of the opponent. People didn't particularly like Chris Kobach, but I think Democrats were thinking they were much stronger in Johnson County. And so those seats didn't come through for them in that instance. And like you said, Austin, there are still a couple of seats, very close. There's one 11-vote margin. There's one 4-vote margin. If these are recounted, that could change it further in the advantage of either party. So a lot of maybe small changes in the House, but obviously right now they're sitting at a supermajority. And with supermajorities in the House and Senate, it could be a difficult year for Governor Kelly.
So let's talk about who she'll likely or potentially be dealing with in House leadership positions. Again, that will be a question for the Republican caucus to figure out. Democrats will also have that conversation in the coming months leading up really around Christmas time and early in that process. But what are we looking at in that scenario?
Well, Speaker Ron Reichman from Olathe has been the speaker for 2 terms. And the general, there's kind of, I guess, a tradition. I don't think it's a law, but it's a tradition that you don't serve longer than 2 terms. But there's no indication that Speaker Reichman wants to give it up. So he may get a challenge from the right, from Dan Hawkins, South Central Kansas legislator, who is currently the majority leader. Of course, if that happens, if there's a shift, then there's kind of a stair-step a domino effect with leadership. I'm not hearing much about Democratic leaders changing. So Tom Sawyer is the minority leader, and he's a veteran legislator, knows a lot. He's been around a long time, knows a lot about tax policy, knows how to count votes. And so I'm not seeing much happening there, but there could be some fireworks on the Republican side.
Sure. So we kind of understand the general makeup at this point of what the legislature is going to look like come January when the session is gavelled back in. As we look at the major issues that are going to be facing these, some new, some veteran legislators, there's a lot on the plate that's going to pertain to public education in particular. There's going to be continued questions around COVID-19, relief from that, policy around that. And really, the bigger concern maybe is the budgetary implications of COVID-19's impact on the economy. So as you look at these election results, where do we feel like we are in those issues, and what are some of the big things we might be looking at in this session?
Well, I'll maybe start by observing we're in a situation now where we have an agreed upon school finance plan being phased in, increases in base aid already passed by the legislature, a Supreme Court retaining jurisdiction. Now, the legislature would still have to pass bills to actually fund those increases, but it would be, I think, very difficult for the legislature to just sort of come in and change very much unless the governor agreed. So part of the question is simply, will the governor be able to put together a budget that continues the steps in education funding already approved? And then will the legislature go along with those choices depending on what alternatives might be in place? I think that's why we keep coming back to the stimulus. And I don't know whether all of our viewers know what we mean by that, because the stimulus on one hand is kind of like, well, what you do in a depression. And this is almost more like relief. I mean, we've faced all states have faced a big cut in revenue. Kansas, excuse me, is expecting to have that. So what we're talking about here is, will the federal government essentially just give us money to backstop lost revenue? That will help Governor Kelly put together a plan that could continue education funding and not cut deeply in other areas. But I think it is fair to say, with a number of new legislators, including in the Senate, many of those who were defeated were part of the coalition that passed this plan and are invested. We're going to have a lot of new members who were not part of putting this together, who may come in with questions and skepticism, issues about the role of the court and everything else. So a key thing to keep in mind, and we'll probably be doing this again next week, is the new state consensus revenue numbers, which will help predict what the state expects to have to spend and the impact on the budget. We should get that late Friday, and then we'll hopefully see over the next several weeks what, excuse me, might happen at the federal level.
Well, and I think related to the COVID situation, I think we have a lot of legislators coming to Topeka who have probably heard a lot of complaints about schools closing and schools not opening and football not being played. And so it will be interesting to see how that plays out as far as public education policy. One major thing the legislature is going to do is they're poised to rewrite the Kansas Emergency Management Act. They had a pretty substantial interim committee that looked at that. And this definitely something that could touch upon public education. So we have a lot of people coming to Topeka who have probably heard a lot of things about schools, and we'll see if that plays out in any kind of policy way during the session.
Another thing might just note that tends to be a line of division between conservatives and moderates, not always, is the conservatives have tended to be much more supportive of the concept of private school funding, public school dollars, school choice, whatever you want to call it. There have been efforts to expand those in Kansas in recent years. Hasn't passed. Seeing more conservative legislators would suggest that those proposals will get more of a hearing. Now, again, how you package that, how the governor might react to it, where those votes would be, that we don't know. But right along the lines of what Scott is saying, dissatisfaction with public schools is likely to get more of a focus on giving alternatives. So I think we'll see that discussion.
It'll certainly be a busy legislative session. And of course, it'll intersect with federal policy and whether or not there is federal relief packages coming down. Leah, any indicators about whether or not that might move one way or another, depending on who wins the top, who wins the Senate, and how that might impact the state level?
Well, I think you'll see if you have a Republican U.S. Senate, you're going to have, generally speaking, a lower funding number, not just for K-12, but for state and local governments as well. That's been their position. I guess if they have to contend with a Democratic president and a Democratic House, and maybe a more fractious Senate overall, depending on what that final margin might be in the Senate. They might have a more of a pull, more of a tug of war. But I think it's going to be very difficult for the higher numbers that we've seen associated with the Pelosi House of Representatives and potentially, say, a Democratic president. It's going to be more difficult for those real high numbers to get through. You know, on the House, the kind of the Democratic position has been around, let's just say, around 200 billion for K-12, and the Senate Republican position has been more around 50 billion. Lots of money, regardless of whether it's billions of dollars, but you know, there's a pretty big gap there between 200 billion and 50 billion. So that's going to be the key right there. And of course, the Senate Republicans have been much more interested in tying some of that relief money to schools that have opened fully in person. So as we see our modalities shift here in Kansas, depending on the virus and the weather, and we're all going to be indoors now this winter, and that's definitely going to be, I think, at least a negotiating point. And we know if we have a Republican President Donald Trump, he's also very invested in that concept. And so if we continue to have the DeVos Trump leadership in the education department, I think we're going to see much more interest in tying some of that relief funding to your reopening status.
And to come back to that school choice or private school aid issue one more time, I think we can look potentially at both levels for supporters to try to leverage that as part of a package.
Yep.
So you could see at the federal level, Republican senators pushing to say, if we're giving money to education, this is our choice plan, or this is what we want to do to help private schools who have had their own struggles. Same way at the state level. And that's part of how we got some of the expansions we had. In fact, the Kansas private school tuition program was packaged into a massive bill with school finance components that was passed back in 2015, 2016 to comply with the first stages of Gannon. Might not have passed on its own, but it was sort of put in with things that really had to happen.
And Austin, I wanted to also mention, I know many of our members have been following the federal efforts around increased broadband funding. We've seen some at the state level, and I think that's actually an area of bipartisan agreement, broadband expansion in Kansas, but we would all be very much boosted by some significant federal funding. And again, the two parties seem to have taken diverging paths on that. You know, Democrats in the $4 to $6 to $8 billion range, and Republicans, in fact, one of their proposals doesn't really have anything for broadband. So that's another area that, again, as Mark mentioned, you know, could be part of a trade or a negotiation, and we will be watching those developments.
Something we've been watching closely for a long time now. Something important to public education in Kansas and really to Kansas infrastructure as a whole. Now, there was one more set of races that was probably flying under the radar for many people across the state, but that's the State Board of Education, certainly not under our radar by any means. And I'd say a surprise win down in Wichita. Kathy Bush losing her reelection bid to Betty Arnold in that seat. Now, we will note that it is a close race at this point, potential for that to move back and forth as we get into canvassing and recount periods at the county level. But right now, it looks like Betty Arnold is going to take that seat. Melanie Haas has also won her race against Benjamin Hodge in Johnson County, filling the vacated seat from Steve Roberts. So Democrats doubled their total on the state board from 2 to 4. So a change in the makeup of the state board and now a new leadership race. So Scott, what are we seeing there? Just how tight is the Arnold Bush race and what implications does that have?
Well, the last time I looked, Arnold was leading by about 60 votes out of 83,000. So that's pretty tight. And Betty Arnold, longtime school board member from Wichita, Kathy Bush, a longtime educator from Wichita, and Kathy Bush, of course, is the chairwoman. And I think it's fair to say a moderate Republican. And so that was an interesting race. I don't know if we'll see much difference policy-wise between the two. In the other race in Johnson County, Melanie Haas, the Democrat, defeated Benjamin Hodge, and Benjamin Hodge really didn't mount a campaign. He didn't update his website. And this was for the seat that is currently held by Steve Roberts, who is stepping down after he made a run for U.S. Senate. I would expect Melanie Haas and Steve Roberts probably differ on many issues, so that may be a difference. So yeah, two interesting State Board of Ed races that, you know, given all the interesting races going on, I could see why it kind of flew under the radar. But and one other thing I wanted to mention, we were talking about the supermajorities in the legislature, not to put another boulder on people's shoulders, but this is the legislature that will be redistricting in 2022. So that with those large majorities, that could have an impact there.
Very important note. Mark?
Well, for some of our viewers who may not follow the Board of Education closely, just to note, 10 members, half are on the ballot every 2 years. So five seats were up. Perhaps surprisingly, maybe not, 3 of the 5 seats were unopposed. Mm-hmm. And I'm only thinking about this because I got some media calls this summer and fall about this. We don't know whether that would be the case if the COVID and the school closing and all those votes had hit earlier, because we certainly know that the State Board of Education, I'm trying to remember whether they received like 10,000 pieces of email or correspondence simply on the issue of whether or not schools could open before Labor Day, which is the governor's proposal. Mm-hmm. And I think that's one thing the State Board will deal with, just as we'll see in the legislature, this question of, well, so what does the State Board do? Is it guidance? Should it be more prescriptive? And I think you've had some State Board members thinking that, for want of a better word, it should be maybe making schools be more cautious. The 5 members who supported the governor's plan to delay opening. But I think there's some interest, and certainly I think one of the incumbent members who thinks the board should be doing more to get schools to reopen in that same way. So I think, and so everyone comes back to, well, what should the State Board do? What's our role? I mean, and there are certain things they clearly do, but they've really taken the position during the whole pandemic that their role is to offer guidance and leave that up to local control. And so all of our local members, you've been able to make very difficult and painful. You've had the opportunity to make these difficult, painful choices to get people upset with you, because the state has really gone on a path of trying to really keep local control as a very high value.
And Mark, to your point, the State Board's been fairly evenly split during the pandemic in kind of response to some of the governor's orders and some of the guidance around COVID. Scott, as you pointed out, we don't expect a big shift between Arnold and Bush, but the Haas and Roberts switch could have implications as the governor continues to work in addressing the pandemic and in her relationship with the State Board.
I mean, as Mark said, that the governor's wanting to delay the start of school, that failed on a 5-5 vote. Steve Roberts was one of those 5 that voted against the governor, and Melanie Haas probably would have voted with her.
Right.
And I guess again, interest of our membership, KASB did not take a position on that issue. We didn't feel we had one, and what we heard from our members was, a lot of our members basically say, well, we say we're for local control, and so we're for local control. We're ready to open. Mm-hmm. We also occasionally hear from members saying this is a really tough choice, and it's a pandemic and it's a statewide issue. So I think as local school leaders, you're going to need to kind of think about the input you're going to want to give in the upcoming session on some of these really tough questions. Now, hopefully we aren't going to have a once-a-century pandemic every year, but this really does go back to those continuing issues. What should we decide locally, local control? What should be set by the state? And even to some extent then up the chain, what does the federal government control or dictate?
Right. So we've taken a pretty broad overlook at the federal level, the state level, little deeper dive into the Board of Education. As we reflect on last night, think ahead to the days that are coming, I'm curious, what are your biggest takeaways from all the races? What are the things that surprised you, jumped out at you that you think are of note that the members should be aware of?
something that has really been on my mind this morning, and I'm sure this sounds pretty corny, but I'm going to go with it anyway. I know there are people who have felt for years, my vote doesn't matter. Big money, the money is always going to decide races, and why should I bother? I'm just one vote. And we saw with the extraordinary turnout, both in the state and on the federal levels, what we're seeing this has been chaotic on all levels. We're all exhausted. But if you look at what that turnout has driven, at the presidential level, we have millions of votes cast for this incredibly important race. And it's coming down to, a representative sort of handful of votes. And you see that again in our state legislative races where we literally have seats that are hanging on 4 votes. If you don't think voting is important, 2020, with all of its negative impacts, has shown us that if Americans get out and vote, they can make a difference. You may not always get the difference that you want, but we really have seen that in the turnout and the change that we have seen as far as that incredible sort of engagement by our citizens. I know I saw a couple of family members post a photo on Facebook yesterday, 2 first-time voters in my family, and these are, well, one of them is an 18-year-old and one of them is that 18-year-old's mother. And so to have 2 first-time voters, that shows you that turnout's up, and we do see both at the federal and the state level how important your vote is.
Yep. Shattering records across the board.
Well, go ahead, Scott.
No, I was kind of going to echo that, and if not only does your vote, every vote count, but really on the local level it does. On the legislative level, we have races that are going to be decided by a handful of votes, and these are the races that determine the funding for your schools. So, yes, Kansas always goes for the Republican in the presidential race, so you may not feel like if you're a Democrat, but your votes count so much on those local legislative races. We could go through the House and Senate and probably switch 20 votes here, 20 votes there, and come up with a completely different legislature. So incredibly important votes, especially at the legislative and local level.
Well, I think it's going to be interesting to see whether so many people have now, for the first time, all over the country, I guess, discovered advanced voting. Mm-hmm. And I certainly am not going to say that voter suppression doesn't have, there are problems around the country we probably typically don't have here. But in the many, many states that now allow advanced voting, the issues that we sometimes hear, long lines and all that, we've really found for most people, if you're serious about voting and willing to vote early, far more people can be in the process. What we also seem to have found is the more people vote doesn't really change the balance very much because we're still very closely divided. I don't know whether that'll last. I think that's that kind of remains to be seen. Scott or Austin, my other thought, I guess, okay, we're gonna find out over the next few weeks where things are. We're gonna have the leadership elections we talked about. Key thing is for school leaders now. So what do you do? And it is kind of striking. I haven't gone back to compare it historically, but we have, out of our 40 senators, 14 new senators, although several from the House. Of 125 House members, 27 will be new. That's almost a fifth of the House. A lot of new people. Some are going to be in new positions. So I think the clear steps that you need to be looking at now is, if you've got a new senator or representative and you haven't got to know them, get to know them. If you need to reestablish those relations with people, please do that. And very quickly, you need to continue to move to that process of what are your priorities for the upcoming session. Make sure you formally adopt and communicate that, as well as having informal conversations. We know many districts will start thinking about pre-session meetings and all of that. It is absolutely critical that you be sharing your priorities and information with your legislators, returning or new ones, and just stress, if there's something we can do to help, let us know. And kind of a final plug, this weekend, our KASB Legislative Committee will be working on another draft of our set of legislative priorities. We'll be sharing that with you. So we need your input as school leaders as we shape our priorities to move into the upcoming legislative session and the work we do with Congress, the state board, and other agencies.
It's a great point, Mark. Voting is a huge step, and to see turnout this high is fantastic. But our hope is always that our members and their communities are engaged in the process, not just an election cycle, but anytime legislation and governing is happening. To use your voice is important throughout the process. And so we are here to support our members and their communities in doing just that. Obviously, you three will be hard at work during the legislative session, continue to track federal policies. And so we're not going anywhere. And we certainly have a lot of questions left. We've all got our computers and have been glued to them for the last 24 hours, continuing to watch presidential results trickle in. It's clear we're probably not going to know anything by the end of the day. That is the perfect plug for Friday afternoon at noon. We're going to do our regularly scheduled advocacy update. We're going to be joined by Dr. Patrick Miller, who's going to help us dig deep into the results we've seen in Kansas, get down to some more of the minutia to see if we can identify some trends, why races went the way they did, what indicators there are for long-term implications, and we're hoping we'll have a slightly better idea of the state of the Senate, state of the White House, final tallies for Congress, and maybe be able to get a better grip on what federal policies are going to look like for the next 2 years. So we hope you'll join us on Friday at noon. We thank you for joining us this afternoon. Scott, Mark, Leah, any final thoughts?
No, great job hosting as always, and really want to thank the other members of our team as we've covered this election and as we continue to do so and as we move into the next steps.
Well, thank you all for your insight and your continued hard work. And it was a late night last night, so we appreciate you being here today. Thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you Friday.